Welcome to episode 275 of the Brainy Business, Understanding the Psychology of Why People Buy. In today's episode, I'm excited to introduce you to Richard Shotton, author of The Illusion of Choice. Ready? Let's get started.
You are listening to the Brainy Business Podcast, where we dig into the psychology of why people buy and help you incorporate behavioral economics into your business, making it more brain-friendly. Now here's your host, Melina Palmer.
Hello, everyone. My name is Melina Palmer, and I want to welcome you to the Brainy Business Podcast. In today's conversation, I'm joined by Richard Shotton. Richard is the author of The Choice Factory, a best-selling book on how to apply findings from behavioral science to advertising. Richard started his career as a media planner 18 years ago, working on accounts like Coke, Lexus, and Compare the Market, before specializing in applying behavioral science to business problems. He's the founder of Astro 10, a consultancy that applies behavioral science to marketing. He regularly runs training sessions with brands big and small, using insights from behavioral science to help solve their problems, and is here today to talk about his brand new book, The Illusion of Choice, 16 and a half psychological biases that influence why we buy. Now, with a title like that, we've got a lot of great conversation ahead of us, so I'm ready to jump into that. I just want to be sure you know before we do that there are links in the show notes for everything, including Richard's books and contact information and related past episodes, all within the app you're listening to and at thebrainybusiness.com/275. Now let's jump right in. Richard Shotton, welcome to the Brainy Business Podcast.
Very nice to meet you.
Yes, you as well. And thank you for bearing with our 15 minutes of random tech stuff. It's been interesting to chat.
It wouldn't be a proper podcast unless there were some tech issues. Yeah.
I know, right? That's, after 200 and I think this episode's going to probably be in the 270s when this comes out. And so, you'd think that we'd have it all together around here, but sometimes things just don't work out the way you want. So, oh well, no worries. So for everyone who doesn't yet know you, of which shame on them, but no, for everyone who doesn't, can you share a little bit about your background and the work that you do in behavioral science?
Yes, of course. So I specialize in applying behavioral science to marketing. So I've come from an agency background. I became interested in behavioral science back in about 2004. And then since then, I've specialized in that area, running a lot of my own research to try and find the best way to apply classic studies to marketing problems. And back in 2018, I released a book called The Choice Factory, where I selected what I thought were the most interesting and relevant behavioral biases that could be applied to marketing. And then since then, I've set up my own company called Astro 10, which I essentially do that for a variety of different brands.
Yeah. So the first, if I remember correctly, I think in The Choice Factory, there were 25 concepts in it. Okay. And then there are 16 and a half in the new book, which so I think that's awesome to have it structured that way. But let's talk a little bit on the background of let's talk about Choice Factory, how this one's a little bit different and, why 16 and a half?
Why 16 and a half? The half's a key one. So, since writing The Choice Factory, I've done another 5 years of research and work. So I've come across plenty more ideas that I think can be applied to marketing. There are literally thousands upon thousands of these biases. So the 25 I cover in The Choice Factory, I think are useful, but it's not completely comprehensive. So this was selecting another 16 and a half that I thought had real merit. And the reason it's half is because that chapter is around the power of precision, about this idea that people are slightly suspicious of brands that claim 10,000 customers or 25 or 20% improvement in their metrics. So there's some lovely work from Schindler at Rutgers University, who shows that if you tell people a deodorant reduces perspiration by 50%, you get a reasonable rating in terms of credibility of that statement. If you get another group of people and tell them the deodorant reduces perspiration by 47 or 53%, you get a 5 to 10% improvement in credibility and accuracy. So it's a very, very simple tactic that brands can apply to give a boost to their messaging and claims.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we definitely feel like the round numbers you see a lot, right? So I feel like there's a bit of herding maybe that comes in there where it's like, well, everybody else does that. That's how we should do it. And maybe that's a little bit of why the precision stands out differently.
Yeah, so that's an interesting one. So there is a lovely study from a psychologist called Santos who coined an idea called the peak effect. So what he did was get some of his grad students to dress up as beggars in California, I think it's San Francisco. And sometimes they go on the streets and ask for people, have you got any loose change or can you spare a quarter? Other times they ask, have you got 17 cents or 32 cents? And what Santos finds is people are more likely to give, and they give more money if you ask for that precise number. Now, he made a slightly different argument. He said it wasn't about the precision per se. He said it was the surprisingness of the number. That if you're walking down the street, you generally, rather than deal with the merits of every beggar that comes up to you, you just have an automatic reaction, which is to say, no, you've got this templated answer. What he says is if you ask in a surprising manner, you at least cause people to break that script, reflect on the question, and the sheer act of reflection increases the probability of responding. So I think you're absolutely right. There's an element of surprise. With the Schindler argument, he makes a slightly different point. His argument is precision is powerful because generally in life, what people experience is if the person they're talking to knows the subject in question, they tend to speak precisely. If they don't really know what they're talking about, they talk in generalities. Like if someone said to me, how old was my brother? I would say 51. If someone said, how old was my second cousin? I'd say in their 40s. Over time, people build this association between precision and knowledge, generality and inaccuracy. And that, I think, also partly explains the power of precision. So don't say 90% of our customers like us, say 91% of customers like us. It's a super simple idea that can be applied. And one that I think you're right, that many brands ignore. They tend to round their numbers.
Right. Where you'd say, and you feel like, yes, we made it to 91%. So now we can say more than 90% like us. Yeah. Right. But in this case, then having that really specific, and sometimes you see, I actually do this where I show the podcast downloads on the website that'll say 722,552 downloads, more than that number, and it's, been at a rounded number for a while where you're able to say 500,000, over 500,000 or whatever. But it's time, to go back to those kind of random numbers. Cause like you said, you look at that and go, that's weird.
It captures attention, which is a very hard thing. It boosts believability. So there's a lot to be said for it. I think the other nice one is if people are thinking about applying this idea, it also works in price. There is a lovely interview of, I think it's Chen, who is the head behavioral scientist at Uber. So he and his team run loads of different experiments to see what changes can they make to boost the probability someone accepts a ride. And one of the things they've found is if they put a surge price at 2x, you get a reasonable level of dropouts. If to another group of people you give a surge price of 2.1x, you actually get a lower level of dropouts. So you get this paradox that Uber are charging more, but more people will accept the offer. And the argument again there is around, well, not just that precision is believable, it's that precise prices tend to be seen as lower than rounded ones. And what's so nice about that study is there's always been evidence, or there's been a lot of studies suggesting that point, but they often came from slightly artificial lab experiments. Chen's using a completely natural data set. These are people going around their everyday life, not even realizing they're in a study. So really, really robust data.
Interesting. Yeah. And I think with all of this, there's both sides of everything. So you talk about precision and you talk about concreteness. There's so much really great stuff in the book. And with our brains, with decisions, with choice, with everything, there's always another side to it. And I love that you include, Rory Sutherland, in the book, and we're in, alchemy, saying the opposite of a good idea is also a good idea, right? Like, it doesn't have to just be, there's one and that's it.
Absolutely. Yes. So I think, there's sometimes a desire amongst marketers to try and find this single solution to communication problems. And that quest is dangerous because life is complex, situations vary, contexts vary. So we shouldn't expect one tactic to work in every single circumstance. So there's a really nice example of that in that generally, if you remove friction, you tend to have a disproportionate impact on people's behavior. People like Thaler often will say, the single biggest thing that he's learned is that if you make it easy, you have a disproportionate effect on behavior. So that is a very strong rule that people should follow. But there are certain circumstances, rare circumstances, when you want to do the opposite. If you want to change people's evaluation of your product, well, then you should add a little bit of friction. The IKEA effect is a well-researched finding for people like Dan Ariely and I think it's Michael Norton. They've shown that if people put more effort into a product, that they'll appreciate it more. So it's not that one bias or one study solves all problems. It's about matching the right study to the right business challenge. If you want to change behavior, remove friction. If you want to boost people's appreciation of your products, you might want to add a bit of friction at a particular moment.
So super preaching to the choir over here. And the audience has definitely heard me say 1.5 million times that we need to that context is the most important thing. We have to spend more time thinking about the problem we're trying to solve. And for everything that you read and see for studies, they're just not going to be perfectly generalizable to whatever it is you're working on. So you need to take a step back, think about what they were trying to accomplish, what your situation is, what are you trying to have people do? And definitely, and I know you talk about this in the book as well, about, there's the question of if you're trying to, get people to change to do something else, or also then asking, why are they not doing this thing already? What is it that we need to be doing as we're looking at habits? So definitely all about finding the right problem and determining, sometimes sludge or friction is actually really helpful, but you have to understand what habits you're creating or undoing and all that good stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the importance of framing the question is key if you're going to use behavioral science practically. So, for example, if you identify the problem for your brand as a lack of trust, maybe that's what you think is the key barrier. Well, suddenly, once you've done that, the biases that you might want to apply are easy to find. There are well-known findings around things like the pratfall effect. If you admit a flaw, you become more believable. You've proven your honesty by admitting that you, let's say, as a product are expensive, like Stella did. That could be a tactic you'd use. We know that claims are more believable if they're made in public rather than private. So you could change your media mix and run on broadcast media rather than one-to-one media. We know that messages that are perceived to be expensive are more believable. So absolutely, once you have identified the barrier that is stopping people behaving the way that you want, then it becomes much easier to match the right experiment, the right bias that could help solve that. So yeah, I completely agree on the need for problem definition.
Yeah. Well, been talking about some really fantastic studies, some insights and things, mostly in that lab sort of context. From your work over the years, do you have some good case studies and applied side where you can maybe talk through some of how you've used this with clients or other things that you've seen?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that I was doing in the run up to the book was finding studies which either weren't very well known or were based on dubious samples. So there's an amazing idea from Ian Begg. So he ran this set of experiments that you kind of referenced earlier around the power of concreteness. So he recruits a group of 24 students and reads out a list of 22-word phrases. So sometimes these phrases are concrete, like square door. Sometimes they're abstract, like subtle fault. And after he's read out this list, immediately he says to people, well, what can you remember? And his key finding is that the abstract terms, only 9% of them remembered, whereas for the concrete terms, 36 of them remembered, 36%. So you've got this huge swing in memorability based on whether terms are concrete or abstract. And Begg's argument is that vision is the most powerful of our senses. And if we can picture a term, then it is very sticky and we remember it. If we can't picture a phrase, it tends to be very forgettable. So I thought that was an amazing opportunity for brands. But the problem was, it's a 50-year-old study. It was run on a sample of 24 people. It was based on students. Frankly, do students, definings amongst students repeat in the population whole? That's a debate. So all I did was take that study, get a much, much larger sample. I worked with a great researcher called Mike Trahan, and we recruited 400 plus people, nationally representative. We changed the words because some of the words in the Begg study were frankly bizarre. Muscular gentleman, flaming forest. And we changed them to things like, happy hens or skinny jeans. These were the kind of the concrete terms brands might use. But we also changed the abstract terms so they were more relevant to the commercial world. So things like trusted, quality, or provenance, I don't know, whatever. And then not only do that, when we read out the words or we gave the words to people, rather than ask them immediately what they could remember, because that's a bit problematic. Brands need people to remember things longer than just a few seconds. We waited 5 minutes and then we asked people what they could remember. And not only did the data we reran support Begg's work, it showed there was an even bigger swing than he'd found. We found that people were 10 times more likely to remember the concrete phrases rather than the abstract ones. So a lot of the book is identifying these lesser known studies. If they are kind of valid and robust, then talk about immediately how brands can apply them. If they are problematic in terms of the research, rerunning them to see whether they still work today in more commercial settings amongst a nationally representative group. And I think something like concreteness, that is eminently applicable in the world of business, the world of communications. Increasingly, brands talk in abstract terms. They talk about things like trust and provenance and quality and value. Begg's argument, which we've supported, would say that it is ineffective to use that language. If you want to communicate one of those abstract objectives, that's absolutely fine, but you have to translate it into much more concrete terminology. So the classic example of that, I think that really demonstrates how powerful that can be, is in the MP3 market. If you remember back to those early ads that people like Philips did, they had the abstract objective of memory, but they communicated them in an abstract way. They talked about 256 megabytes of memory or 128 megabytes of memory. What Apple did so brilliantly was avoid those abstractions. They still had the abstract objective of memory, but they talked about 1,000 songs in your pocket. Now, you can picture a pocket. That's concrete, that's memorable. And it made for probably one of the most powerful ads of the era. So yeah, that was one of the kind of broad practical themes that's repeated in the book.
Yeah, I love that example and this concept. And so many things and thoughts that I have here that I'm going to just sort of run through. But like you're saying, I read a lot of books. I read a lot of studies for my work, for the podcast, for all the things. And one of the things that I was pleasantly surprised, and there are definitely things in the book that's like, oh yeah, I'm familiar with that one, got that one, because I know more than most. And there were a lot in there that I had not come across before. And I enjoy that. That is something that, and then being able to see, like you said, where it was clear that you did a really nice job of saying, here are some of the flaws with that one. And so we did it again, and this is what we found. And that is, like you said, that the precision of that, the understanding of like, we saw this, we understand it enough to realize what wasn't working or why this might not be usable today, where there could be errors. And so went back through and did it again. But everything is still so quippy is not the right word, but it's like a fast clip going through the book, right? So you're not feeling the weight of research as you're going through, even though there's a lot of research in it. It's a really good read.
I'm glad you felt that. One of the frustrations I sometimes have is that academics, and I think sometimes practitioners, make behavioral science more complex than it needs to be. Reading especially modern academic papers is a chore. I mean, they are written in verbose, jargon-filled language, full of statistics. And I think that's often unnecessary. And I think sometimes it speaks to a kind of perverse desire to signal to other academics that this is weighty and important. But the danger is, if the behavioral science is written in a way that it takes ages to decipher, it means that it becomes less likely the findings will be applied. What I want to do is write them as simply as possible, and then put the focus on not deciphering the information, but the focus, hopefully the reader is thinking, well, how can I then go and apply it at my business, my company? Simple in my mind is good.
Yeah, I'm in that business as well. And I know that I can't imagine that anyone would ever remember the actual name of the ridiculous paper that has I know you talk about it in the book. Do you remember the name of it or have it written down somewhere?
The Oppenheimer paper. So there's a 2006 paper from Oppenheimer called Consequences of Erudite Vernacular, or Problems with Using Long Words Needlessly. It's probably the best academic name for a paper. It's wonderful, wonderful. But essentially, yes, it's the point that he finds in controlled conditions, if you give someone an abstract of a academic paper and it's written in a jargon-heavy, unnecessarily complex way, and they rate the intelligence of the author, that group will rate intelligence, I think, at 13% less than people who read the same abstract where the complicated words have been replaced by simpler synonyms. So Oppenheimer's argument is people labour under the assumption that communicating in a complicated way will reflect well on them, but all the evidence is actually, if you communicate simply, you come across as more prestigious and more intelligent. That, I think, is a really useful insight for B2B communication in particular, but many, many categories.
Yeah, definitely. And I always go back to, I believe that Einstein had said, if you can't explain it to a 6-year-old, you don't understand the concept well enough yourself.
Oh, very nice. Yeah, very nice. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's kind of if you have to be talking in these big terms, you don't understand how it all really can work together. And clearly Einstein was talking about some really complex stuff.
Yes. Yeah. I think I'd probably still struggle with that stuff. Yeah.
And so you have applied in there too, though. So yeah, in academia, we see that, and there are definitely academics that listen to the show. But then on the applied side of this, and I know you give the example of, marketing concepts and feeling like we don't want to be rhyming anymore. But there's a lot of value in that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So many listeners will be familiar with the Keats heuristic. So I think couple of papers, 1999, 2000, around this idea from McGlone and his partner, whose name I cannot pronounce. I think it's Jessica Toffingbash, but I might have done that slightly wrong.
Say sorry, Jessica, if we got it wrong.
Yes, right? Yeah, apologies about that. So what they essentially show is a group of people, they all get what look like proverbs. All these proverbs have the same meaning. But sometimes they're in rhyming form, sometimes they're in non-rhyming form. So it might be, the rhyming form might be what sobriety conceals, alcohol reveals. The non-rhyming form might be what sobriety conceals, alcohol unmasks. So some people get the rhyming phrase, some get the exactly the same meaning, but in a rhyming form. People are then asked to say how believable, how accurate this statement is. And the psychologists found that rhyming phrases were believed significantly more than the non-rhyming ones. So I've always thought that was a fascinating study. But there were areas that I think are of interest that the academics didn't look at. Yes, an advertiser wants to boost believability, so therefore rhyme should be helpful. But they also want to boost memorability. And what's interesting is if you look at many popular phrases, they're often in rhyme. And I think that suggests maybe it's because that's an easy way for people to remember things. So we took the phrases from that classic study. We gave them to a small group of participants in the morning, got them to read through the list, invited them back 9 hours later and asked them to remember as much as they could. And we found that people were twice as likely to remember the rhyming phrases as the non-rhyming phrases. So there was a second reason why brands should consider rhyme. And then actually we reran the experiment with alliterating phrases. So looking at other well-known techniques poets and writers have always used to see if it had a similar effect. And alliterating phrases have a boost to believability and a boost to memorability. Not the scale of rhyme, but certainly a statistically significant one. So the argument, I think, holds for both of those, that if something is easy to process, people often conflate that with truth. That's the argument from the psychologists, and it seems to work across those two types. Now, that's particularly interesting for advertisers because a colleague and I went to the archives, looked at loads and loads of different newspapers, and we painstakingly categorized whether or not advertisers going back to the 1970s used rhyme or not. And you see this precipitous decline. Back in the 1970s, I think it was about a third of ads in Britain used a rhyming strapline. By the early 2000s, 2010s, I think it was down to less than 10%. So you've got lots of modern evidence that rhyme boosts memorability and believability, yet advertising's going in the opposite direction. It's decreasing the use of this proven technique. So hopefully, broadcasting some of this new data might hopefully slow that decline and encourage advertisers to go back to some of the tried and tested techniques of the past.
Yeah, just because it's old doesn't mean it's wrong.
Yes, yeah. And I think the worry is if it's about signaling your sophistication to your peers, rhyme's a bloody awful way of doing it. It doesn't feel modern and cutting edge. So if you want to be admired by other creative directors, it's not a great technique. But if you want to get your message sticking in people's mind, if you want to get your message understood and believed, it's very good. So if, we've got to make sure that what we are doing in this industry is what our clients want us to do, rather than worrying about the kudos that we as individuals get.
Yeah. And I know that for people listening too, there's an interesting conundrum there because, of course, we then look at the social proof, right? So winning awards is something that helps clients want to come to us and find us. And so we might have the argument that, well, if I'm not winning awards, then I'm not able to do this. And that does help my clients because then they win awards too, and they get to show the value. So maybe there's a way to mix these things in together.
Yes. I think the problem with awards is often they are international. And if you've got an international jury, linguistic puns or rhymes might not translate very well. So I think the internationalization of creative awards leads to a prioritization of the visual over the verbal. The visual works in every culture, works across borders certainly much better. The verbal doesn't so much.
Yeah, back to the kind of concreteness piece, right? That we're able to have that tie into some version of emotion, and using the senses of, that visual input is really strong. So, well, thank you for all of that. I really appreciate it. There was one other study that's in here that, there are a million, there are so many, I love it all. But there was one that I actually, my husband's on a business trip. And so I sent the text of a quote because I was like, whoa, this is such a cool thing, which has to do with rolling the dice at dinner.
Oh, yes, sorry. Yeah, there's
I know, I'm trying to like tee it up in a way that I know, because you got...
Yeah, no, there's a few. I was like, God, I've completely...
I would have been able to tell you more. I've got the quote ready.
No, I know what you mean now. So there is a chain of, I think they're Parsi cafes in Britain called Dishoom. So there's about a dozen of them, very nice restaurants. They have a problem that people don't particularly want to go on a Monday, though. So on a Monday, if you go into the restaurant, they will bring out at the end of the meal a big brass dice called the matka. You get to roll that dice, and if you get a 6, everything you've eaten, everything that the table's drunk, well, it's completely free. Now, the way that people react to this is with, ecstatic excitement. An economist would say, well, you're only giving someone, on average, a 16.66% discount. So what's interesting is the way people react to this uncertain variable reward is completely different to how the restaurant as a whole would have reacted if everyone got 16.666% discount. And that fits with an awful lot of research. Go all the way back to work by people like B.F. Skinner, that if you want to train animals, you don't give them a reward every time they do what you want. You sometimes give them a big reward, sometimes small, sometimes nothing at all. It's the variability and the uncertainty that kind of turbo boosts behavior change. So I think that's a really interesting area that could be applied far more. Because when it comes to loyalty schemes, what most brands do is adopt a very transactional relationship with their customer. They say, you buy 10 coffees, we will give you 1 free cappuccino. What the work of B.F. Skinner in animals and Luxi Shen on human shows is that is not as effective as it could be. What would be much better is to empower your barista to randomly give out 1 in 10-ish coffees free. And there's a chain of coffee shops in Britain and beyond, Pret, that actually do that. And the benefit is you get is, firstly, people are far more excited because it's surprising. Secondly, the staff love it because they feel like in control and empowered. And you're harnessing this psychological technique which will change behavior more effectively than that search reward. So it's a lovely idea that can be applied in many a way.
Yeah. So for when we are talking, this is right after the episode came out that I did on, so I did a series on all the biases is what I called it, which of course doesn't include everything, but just like a big summary of 8 different episodes. And I kind of tried to group them. One of them was called Math is Hard, which is looking at all the biases we have around numbers and things. And so with that, there's some of the different ratios and calculations and things where for the, we'll say lay person, but someone who's going out, even if you understand some of the math and the rolling of the die, like you said, at the 16.66%, like I don't believe that. And we think about the odds and like, oh, I could win. Even if you said on Mondays, everyone gets 20% off, Yeah. And maybe I'll get 1 extra thing. But if you know that this is the thing on Monday, everyone's going to order a little bit more because they might get you might get it all for free. So it's like, well, let's all have a drink. Let's go ahead and get dessert. And like, I bet today will be
the prize fund. We're by having an extra beer.
Right. We're taking advantage of this. And that's obviously really smart too. If you don't want to roll before they eat, because then the discount, that's no good.
Then you're going bankrupt. Yeah.
Right.
Timing is important.
Yeah. With all of that. So it's so interesting of this. And then, so taking though, again, the step back and thinking about the experience and the fun and the joy of that. And like you said, with loyalty programs, I also have an episode on inequity aversion and how we think that, fair and equal and equitable are the same, and they are not. And especially when we look at loyalty programs and we think about that, well, if somebody gets something and someone else didn't, everyone's going to get mad. But that's really not how it works. And when we look at the, dopamine anticipation, like you were talking about, of being able to have a little surprise and delight, we pull the expectation out of it. It can be so much more fun of an experience. And then people see it and they talk about it, and it just makes for so much better experience.
Yeah. So I think that, that area of fairness is an absolutely fascinating one. And I think you mentioned earlier about, well, what are the kind of practical things that you can do to apply this? There's a lovely study that I came across while writing the book by, it's Blount and Baseman. I think it might be 1996. And it's a really clever study. They get students at university who've just arrived, and they pretend that they want to hire these students to take part in a psychology experiment. And sometimes they pay let's say, students might get this slightly wrong. They offer them $7, and a significant proportion agree to take part in the experiment. They're told it's going to take half an hour of your time. We'll pay you $7. Is that fair enough? Most people say yes. Next group, they offer them $8, but they begin by apologizing and saying, okay, really sorry. Earlier groups were paid $10, but we've run out of cash. Now, in that second scenario, even though they're offering a higher wage, about 25-ish% lower volume of people agree to take part. What Blount and Baseman argue is people are not just interested in maximizing the financial benefit from a situation. They also want to know that they have been treated relatively well. They haven't been taken advantage of. Now, that at first sounds an interesting study, but what the hell do you do with it? But you can take that and you can apply it, today to your e-commerce site. Now, what normally happens, most e-commerce sites, have a wonderful process. People have picked their lovely item, they've stuck it in their basket, they go to pay, and then just before they're going to hand over their cash, there is a giant box normally that says, add your discount code. Now, what Blount and Baseman say is that is a transgression of fairness. People might previously have thought the item they're about to pay for is great value. As soon as they know that other people have got a discount code and get it cheaper, you're going to anger them, you're going to irritate them, and they'll probably go off elsewhere looking to find that code. Many might not come back. So once you know that as an e-commerce site, you can take that principle and say, well, okay, either we get rid of the box entirely, or maybe more sophisticatedly, I think like Uber do this, you get rid of the box and you just put a really faint line, saying add a discount code here. That works really well because people who've got a code will be looking for that area. People who haven't might well miss it. Or you could be even more sophisticated still and only show the discount box to people who you've driven to the site via an affiliates link or an email which has mentioned the discount. Lots of different tactics that you could apply, all based on a single experiment. So yeah, I think fairness is something I'm becoming increasingly interested in. And I think there are both tactical ways you can apply it, like we've been discussing, or big strategic ways you can apply it. Reframe your competitor as transgressing fairness, and you can often anger people enough to get them to go through the hassle of switching and the hassle of moving away from that existing brand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. It was in a running against Nixon and the political campaign, right? That you had in the book of the saying, would you want this person to sell you a car?
Yeah, I think that was the 1960 JFK versus Nixon election. Yeah, but yeah. Well, that's a wonderful political ad. I think it's one of the great political ads. Yeah, lovely example of.
Makes you think about it a little bit differently versus where if you say like, he can't be trusted. And these days, oh my goodness, political ads are the worst. And you feel like it's just all slander and libel everywhere, right? But yeah, feels different when you're asking that question. I'm all about the power of questions. So I like seeing that in the book too. Yeah,
that was one of the more, I think, surprising findings. I guess it comes down to this point of, if I, as the Democratic Party, say Nixon is bad, Nixon is untrustworthy, our defensive reaction, if we're not necessarily a Democratic voter, springs into action. We feel threatened. We generate lots of counter arguments why that statement is wrong. But if it's posed as a question and, I answer it myself, well, who do I trust more than myself? So I think it's a very clever way of giving people pause for thought and maybe influencing them more subtly. Yeah, so I think, I think politics is a fascinating area where you can definitely apply some of these ideas.
Yes, definitely. There's so many applications to all of it, right? Because you're always communicating with humans in some aspect or another, whether I know I have people ask a lot like, well, let's say I work in a B2B context, or we have we have multi-million-dollar projects we're selling. So this doesn't apply. Yes, it does.
I mean, that is a very common reaction. Okay, this stuff works on, small inconsequential decisions, but it's not going to work on my really important brand. The fascinating thing, though, is, of course, there is loads of evidence that behavioral science is just as powerful on professionals as it is on consumers. One of my favourite studies, probably 2018, 2019, the Australian government used social proof to try and encourage doctors to hand out fewer antibiotics. So they send out letters to 6,600 GPs or doctors. Sometimes they try and educate those people to give out fewer antibiotics. And when they do that, it barely makes any difference. Doctors being told about the social dangers of antibiotics will reduce their prescription by a couple of %. But doctors who are told you are giving out more prescriptions than 80% of your peers sees a huge reduction, 12.5% reduction in antibiotic prescription rates. So you've got this pretty much 6-fold increase in the reduction of prescription rates based on harnessing a bias that if you ask those doctors directly, they would deny would ever influence them. So yeah, as far as I've seen, most of the evidence points to the fact that professionals are just as influenced as consumers with the vast majority of biases. The only difference is they are even more loath to admit it.
Yeah, definitely. So do some good testing, right? As you're going to look, and I bet you'll find that this works regardless of, where you are. And like we said, though, context is so important, understanding what you want people to do and looking at how you can test those things. So one last question before we get into how people can get in touch with you and learn more, because I am confident everyone will. This has been such a fun conversation. So where you say that so what is your process of finding these hidden gem research stories? Where's your go-to? How do you go find the stuff that makes it into the book?
I'm a big fan of starting with popular books. So you'll read through a popular book, you'll get half dozen ideas, and then go to the footnotes, find the original paper, and then go and read the original paper. Because often the paper might have a slightly different angle from that in the book. The book might have a kind of a theory running through it that they're trying to just tweak the papers to support. So I think going back to the original gives you a different angle. And often it will then send you off with different nuances, other satellite experiments that might be relevant. So yeah, I think in terms of time efficiency, podcasts, books are a wonderful way of quickly understanding lots and lots of different experiments. And then the ones that you think are most interesting, definitely worth going and finding the original paper and exploring that further. And the great thing is if you use something like Google Scholar, 9 times out of 10, you can get that paper for free. It'll be on the academic's website or it'll be available for free to download somewhere. So it doesn't have to be an expensive tactic.
Yeah. And then, looking at its citation list, right? So like, what was that based off of and
Absolutely.
what was that based off of?
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that. I was going to say, is there some amazing treasure trove somewhere that we don't know? But Google Scholar, of course, is a good place to go and search for things. Yeah.
Google Scholar's, brilliant. You put the paper title into that, give you 10 different versions. And if it has next to the paper title PDF, generally that means it's free to download.
Yeah, that's my go-to too. Yeah, I get yes, no, that's super, super helpful. So like I said, now for everyone who's so excited, of course, we'll have links for all the things. We talked about so many amazing things. Some of those articles I often link in the show notes. So some of the ones you've mentioned today, we'll also have links to both of your books. And what's the best way for other people, to get in contact with you, to learn more, to follow you, all that good stuff?
Oh, so my Twitter handle is @rshotton, so RSHOTTON. So DM me on that. That's a very good way. Or drop me an email at richard@astro10.co.uk. And more than happy to help if I can. And hopefully either the Choice Factory or the Illusion of Choice is a kind of useful book for people who want to find the ideas that are most relevant to commercial communications.
For sure. And I will say, not just hopefully, these are both very, very useful books. I highly, highly, highly recommend them both. They're enjoyable. They're easy to read. There's so much in them. You'll definitely be smarter after reading these. So enjoy them. And thank you so much again for joining me on the show, Richard. It was so much fun to chat with you.
Thank you.
Thank you again to Richard Shotton for joining me on the show today. What got your brain buzzing in today's conversation? For me, I really enjoyed this conversation with Richard and what a depth of knowledge he has in the field. The Choice Factory was one of the first really applied books that I came across, and I loved how much practical advice it included. And so I think the bar was really high for The Illusion of Choice. But of course, Richard delivered in a big way that exceeded expectations. Even something as simple and dedicated as a subhead about the 16.5 psychological biases lets you know that this is different, and it builds curiosity and makes you want to lean in and learn more. As you heard on the show today, he has lots of great tips and insights and stories to keep you interested and learning along the way. Such a fun book and conversation today with Richard. There's an easy link so you can get your copy of The Illusion of Choice, as well as Richard's first book, The Choice Factory, and other related books and past episodes, all within the show notes for this episode, which are in the app you're listening to and at thebrainybusiness.com/275. And thank you again to Richard Shotton for joining me on the show today. It was a delight to chat with and learn from you. Join me Tuesday for another Brainy episode of the Brainy Business Podcast. It's going to be a lot of fun. You won't want to miss it. Until then, thanks again for listening and learning with me. And remember to be thoughtful.
Thank you for listening to the Brainy Business Podcast. Molina offers virtual strategy sessions, workshops, and other services to help businesses be more brain-friendly. For more free resources, visit thebrainybusiness.com.